The first time the children felt warm again, truly warm from the marrow out, it wasn't from a log fire or a stove. It was from sunlight, pouring like molten gold through the glass walls of the strange little cabin no one believed in. But by then, the laughing had stopped. By then, the storm had taken the others. It started with silence, not the kind that comes from peace, but the brittle, listening kind, the kind that comes when even the animals stop moving, when frost creeps beneath the doorframe and holds its breath at the threshold. Nora Clark woke that morning with ice on her hair. She sat up slowly, the wool blankets stiff with frost where they'd touched the edges of the cot, and she didn't call for the children just yet. It was the sort of cold that made your voice stick in your throat. Your lungs didn't want to trust it. Beside her, the window, real glass, not papered muslin like most of the cabins near Elk Hollow, had filmed over white, but already the morning sun was starting to bleed through. She slid her feet onto the floor and didn't flinch. That part was important. It meant the temperature inside hadn't dropped past dangerous in the night. Still bitter, still awful, but not deadly, not like the stories from the last blizzard. That time it had been the cabin down by the creek. 3 children, 2 parents, and all 5 gone before the wind stopped. Just stopped breathing in the night. The fire gone out, and frost creeping over their lips. Nora stood and looked at her hands. They weren't blue. Her fingers moved without pain. The cabin was holding. They'd laughed when she built it, called it a sun jar, called her a fool, said it'd turn into a death trap the first time winter rolled in. No one wanted to say the word widow out loud, not since Seth Clark died in the 2nd year of the drought, and everyone started tiptoeing around her like she might fall apart. But the way they said her little glass hut told the truth just fine. She didn't care, not when the frame went up, not when the old peddler delivered the mismatched panes of glass from his mule cart one long summer week, not even when her brother-in-law Reuben shook his head and walked away in front of the whole town meeting, muttering something about no woman raising kids in a greenhouse. She had something they didn't. Notes, pages and pages of them, left behind by Seth, dug out from the bottom of an old army chest that had survived 3 moves across the territory. Sketches, numbers, designs for passive thermal capture in frontier shelters. Strange phrases she couldn't quite understand but learned to repeat and trace and believe in because he'd believed in them. And now, with snow smothering the hilltops, she believed in them too. She crossed the cabin to the wall where the sun had found its way in. It wasn't warm yet, not by any stretch, but the floor near the southern wall was already losing its frost, the trapped heat sinking into the dark stone tiles Seth had laid years ago, salvaged from a church that had burned outside of Red Rock. They absorbed light like nothing else, held it. Behind her, the children stirred. Rosie first, then Will. Rosie's voice came quiet. "Mama, is it morning?" "It is. It's not cold." Her voice was surprised, maybe even afraid. "How come?" Nora didn't answer right away. She ran a hand over the nearest wooden beam, felt the faintest trace of condensation, not frost. "Because the sun remembered us," she said softly. They crawled from bed, bundled in patchwork coats, and stood near the wall as the sun brightened. Already the difference was noticeable. The glass had fogged, but behind it the world was blinding white. Snowdrifts piled to the lower edge of the sills. But inside, that corner of the house felt like a different world. Not hot, but not death. She made breakfast with shaking hands, not because of the cold, but because she didn't know if it would last. The problem was the glass cabin only worked if the sun showed up, and the wind was shifting. By afternoon, the clouds returned, grey and flat. Wind swept in from the north, rattling the trees. The warmth fled. She added extra hay bales against the outside wall, tucked the children into the back room near the stone oven, and lit a low fire. The fire wasn't meant to heat the home. It couldn't, not the whole place, but it kept the core from freezing, just enough. Then she sat at the table and stared at the southern wall, where the glass stood tall and silent like a cathedral window. It was the same sun trap Seth had drawn in the sketches, same angles, same floor stones, same internal wall insulation, where he'd packed clay and straw and crushed black rock beneath the floorboards. He'd called it thermal batterying. She hadn't believed it until she saw the ice melt at dawn, but it was all for nothing if the clouds didn't break. By nightfall, the wind had picked up enough to howl. It wasn't just the sound of it that worried her. It was the silence between gusts, the sudden, sharp stops, like something thinking before it struck. And just before midnight, there came a knock on the door. A knock. She bolted upright from the cot, heart hammering. Who would knock? In this cold? The dogs weren't barking. There were no dogs. She hesitated, and then it came again. 3 times, slow, not desperate, not panicked, just a knock. She wrapped herself in her shawl, took the iron stove poker in her hand, and moved to the door, pressed her ear to the timber. A voice, low. "Nora Clark?" She opened the door. Reuben, but not the Reuben she remembered. Not the one in the thick brown coat, the full beard, the wide shoulders. This one looked hollowed out, covered in frost. His face was red and cracked. His breath came shallow. Behind him, two other figures, both men, neither she recognized. "Fire out!" he rasped. "Chimney cracked, cabin full of smoke. We came." He didn't say it, but she saw it in his eyes. They came to the glass cabin, and she realized with a terrible chill that something had shifted in the storm. The laughing had stopped. Reuben didn't ask to come in. He stood there on the porch, barely a shadow against the swirling gray behind him, snow already building in the folds of his coat. The two men with him said nothing. Their heads were bowed, like oxen that had been whipped for too many miles. Nora didn't hesitate. She stepped aside and nodded. "Come in before you freeze." They obeyed, not with thanks, but with a sort of quiet shame, as though they were stepping into a place they'd once mocked in jest and now feared in truth. Reuben paused just past the threshold, his eyes scanning the strange walls, the glass, the straw-packed seams, the stone floor half lit from beneath the coals. His lips parted, but he said nothing. Nora shut the door behind them and braced it against the gust. The sound it made was different than it used to be, fuller, heavier, like the wind itself had teeth now. She turned and found the children already watching. Rosie was holding the hearth brush like a spear, eyes wide. Will stood just behind her, one arm wrapped around the leg of the chair. "Will," Nora said softly, "put more wood on, just one log." He moved quick. The oven caught with a faint exhale, and then the shadows on the floor danced again. She looked at Reuben. What happened? He didn't answer right away. He peeled off his gloves, then his coat. The snow in his beard was half melted from breath. "Chimney cracked," he said finally. "Wasn't the first time, but this time it gave. Smoke poured back in. I tried to fix it. He gestured to the other two men. "They were with me, stopping for the night." One of the strangers coughed into a rag. The sound had a rattle to it, thick and wet. "Too late to turn back," Reuben went on. "Too far from town. I remembered you were up here. Figured you wouldn't turn us away." Nora watched him a long moment. He hadn't said her name in months. Not since he called her a fool at the spring meeting. Not since he'd said no man would live under glass unless he meant to cook himself. She motioned toward the bench near the table. "You'll have to stay low. Heat sinks toward the floor when it's like this." Reuben nodded and sat. The strangers followed, grateful but wordless. Nora noticed how the younger of the two winced when he bent. A frostburn, maybe, or worse. She handed them cups of boiled chicory and didn't ask more questions. There was no time for accusations in a freeze like this, just quiet acceptance that life was brittle and cruel, and shelter didn't care who had laughed at whom. It either held or it didn't. That night, they all huddled together near the central oven. Nora kept the fire low, just enough to hold the cabin's core, above freezing. Outside, the wind peeled at the sky. Around 3 a.m., the storm broke open fully, not with snow, but with sound. Something cracked. Not trees, not ice, something else, distant but unmistakable. Rosie sat upright. "Mama, I heard." "What was it?" Nora didn't answer. She stood and stepped toward the back wall, where the eastern glass faced the woods. She couldn't see much through the dark, just streaks of wind-blown snow and the vague shape of branches swaying. But the sound came again, not close, not a threat, just a reminder, a cabin falling. Somewhere out there, someone else's roof had just collapsed. She sat back down and pulled the children close. Reuben was awake. He said nothing, just stared at the firelight flickering in the glass. By morning, the clouds began to thin again. The temperature hadn't risen, but the light broke through in narrow beams. The interior walls of the cabin began to glow with faint warmth. The dark stone soaking in what it could, the black floor tiles near the south end already thawing faster than the rest. Nora stepped into the main room and held her hands near the southern wall. It was working, slowly, but working. She looked over her shoulder at Reuben. "Tell me how far your chimney cracked." He blinked, bleary. "All the way through, top to base. It was old brick, probably froze solid and split." "Did you try venting?" He gave a short laugh. "Venting what? I couldn't even see the fire. Whole room was smoke before I could blink." She nodded. "It wasn't built to hold in a freeze. You said so yourself." He stiffened. "And I was wrong." The children watched him. "I don't know how this place of yours works," Reuben said. "But it's warm, not just from fire. I can feel it in the floor, like there's heat under it. I don't understand it." "You don't have to." He glanced at the wall of glass. The panes weren't perfect. Some were mismatched, scavenged. A few had a greenish tint. One had a hairline crack sealed with resin. But they stood, sloped at just the right angle, facing south, backed with black painted mud that absorbed light like a sponge. "Seth built it?" Reuben asked quietly. Nora nodded. "He started it. I finished it." Reuben rubbed a hand through his hair. "I didn't think it would last a week." "It won't last if the wind breaks that southern wall, or if we get a full whiteout. But for now, The younger stranger coughed again. His cheeks were flushed, not with warmth but fever. Nora turned. "He needs rest and broth." Reuben looked up. "Can he stay here?" "He already is. But if you'd rather we—" "Don't be stupid," she snapped. "No one leaves in this." Reuben shut his mouth. Nora didn't speak again until she'd spooned out the last of the dried lentils and set them to simmer. Then she sat down across from him and said, "How many cabins were lost last night?" He hesitated. "At least 2, maybe more. I saw smoke over the ridge, not chimney smoke, the bad kind." "Fire?" He nodded. "Then we're not the only ones taking in strays." Reuben leaned forward. "Nora, you could teach this, whatever this is, how you built it, why it works." She stared at him. "And how many would listen now that they're freezing?" His silence was answer enough. She stood. "They laughed when I started it. You laughed." "I know. They said it was foolish, that it wouldn't hold heat, that it was too fragile, that I was a widow and didn't understand shelter. I know. But now you're here." Reuben looked ashamed. "You could still teach it." She turned toward the sunlit wall and placed a hand against the glass. It was warm now, faintly, like the skin of an animal. It pulsed with something deeper than temperature, memory. "I'm not ready to share it," she said, "but it could save—" "I'm not ready," she said again. By nightfall, the stranger's fever had broken. Will helped carry more water in from the covered barrels outside, scraping off the ice and hauling the slush to boil. Rosie sat with Reuben, playing quiet rounds of dominoes with pieces her father had carved before the war. Nora moved from wall to wall, checking seams, tightening lashes, pressing against the base to feel for drafts. The design held, but not forever. She found herself kneeling by the southern wall again after sundown, staring at the glass. And it was there, in the glass's reflection, that she saw the flicker. A glow, faint, far, not the moon, not lightning, a fire, down in the valley, too large to be a hearth, too orange to be a lantern. It didn't move. Nora's breath caught. Someone else's home was burning, and something inside her broke loose. She stood, walked to the back, found the bundle of Seth's old notes, spread them on the table. Reuben looked up. She slid them toward him. "If I don't make it through the week, you will. Take these." He frowned. "What are you saying?" She turned toward her coat. "I'm saying someone's fire just went up down in the valley, and there may still be people inside." Reuben stood, startled. "You're going out there? Now? If it were you, would you want me to wait?" He shook his head slowly. "Then I'm coming too." "No," she said. "You stay with the children. Keep the fire low. Use the light wall if the clouds break. The heat will rise. Use the straw blinds to trap it. You remember how?" He nodded, stunned. She grabbed her coat, her pack, her old snow goggles. "If I'm not back by dawn, show Rosie how to stretch the clay over the cracks if the wind breaks the corner. It seals tight. You really think it'll come to that?" She looked at him. "I hope it doesn't." Then she was out the door, into the storm, into the cold, toward the fire that meant someone's last hope had just failed. And behind her, the cabin, the one they all mocked, stood like a lantern in the dark. She didn't remember the moment her gloves soaked through, or when the cold slipped past her collarbone. The wind had a way of chewing through layers until even the thickest wool became nothing but wet gauze against your back. But she kept walking, step by step, down into the hollow where the flickering light danced behind the dark pine line. Slower now, and redder. Nora counted her breaths to keep moving, one for every 3 steps. Left, right, pull, the snow dragging against her boots, crusted and cracked like a skin too tight for the bones beneath. Her legs burned, but she knew better than to stop. It hadn't been that far when she saw the first blaze from the glass wall. Maybe a half-mile, maybe more. Distance lied in snow. It swallowed depth, blurred trees into brush, into shadows, into fear. And every gust of wind pulled at the shape of the world. But she saw the glow again, this time lower, like the last gasp of a dying fire. Her feet hit solid earth, a slope hidden beneath the snow, and she fell, sliding on her side through a drift that reached past her waist. The cold surged into her ribs. She rolled once, landed on her elbow, and bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. When she opened her eyes, she was looking straight at it. The cabin had collapsed inward, like a chest caving around the heart. One wall remained, splintered, blackened. 2 timbers still burned near the edge, slow and stubborn, pulsing red through the ruin. Nora pushed herself up. Her legs shook. The snow had thinned near the cabin, scorched away in a rough circle where the heat had blasted out. She could smell the ruin now. Cedar smoke, scorched oil, something worse. She called out, "Hello?" No answer. Again, louder. "Is anyone here? Anyone alive?" Only the fire answered. She moved forward slowly, boots crunching across ice-slick ash. Her lantern barely touched the edges of the scene. Smoke still rose in curling plumes from the fallen beams. The roof had given first, crushed inward by weight or rot or the sheer wrongness of the storm's pressure. The back half of the structure was gone, vanished into cinders. But then, movement. Nora froze. Something stirred in the wreckage near what had once been a hearth. She stepped closer. A hand, blackened, but not still. She dropped to her knees and dug. Ash and snow mixed in her fingers. The smell was thick now, choking, but the hand moved again, faintly, and she found the shape of a shoulder beneath it. A face, a child. She gasped. Hold on, sweetheart, I've got you." She didn't speak again, no more words, just motion. Her hands moved fast enough she didn't feel the burn until much later. She cleared the beam, pulled fabric loose from the wreckage, yanked a splintered door off its hinges to use as a sled. Then she dragged the boy up, no more than 8 years. Old, maybe younger, face covered in soot, coughing in short, frantic gasps. Still alive. She wrapped him in her coat, tied him to the makeshift sled, and began the journey back, uphill. That's when the wind really began. It came down off the ridge like a falling wall. Not a breeze, not even a gust. A wall, a pressure that hit hard enough to stagger her backward. The sled twisted behind her, and she fell again, elbows sinking deep into a new drift. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she couldn't waste the breath. She got up, pulled the rope, one step, then another. She thought of Rosie, of Will, of the way Rosie said, "It's not cold," that morning, like she couldn't believe such a thing was possible anymore. She thought of the glass wall, the one everyone mocked. She thought of Seth's handwriting. She pulled the sled. Inside the cabin, Reuben watched the frost climb halfway up the southern glass before the clouds began to part. He stood with Rosie near the wall, both of them wrapped in blankets. The stranger, the younger man, had stopped coughing. Will was spooning warm water to him slowly, careful not to spill. "She's been gone too long," Reuben muttered. Rosie didn't answer. Reuben bent low and checked the floor near the hearth. Still warm. The coals pulsed a deep, steady red. The warmth was faint but not failing. "Not yet. You trust her," he said aloud. "You think she'll come back?" Rosie looked up. Her face had that too-old look children get in long winters. "She doesn't break promises." Reuben sat down beside her. The wind howled again outside. The glass shuddered faintly, not from cold, but from sound, like the storm wanted to scream its way through the seams. He closed his eyes and remembered the way the chimney cracked back home, how the fire coughed once and then roared backward into the room, black smoke pouring out in curtains. How he'd grabbed his boots before his coat, how one of the strangers had fallen flat and started choking before they'd even reached the trees. He should have listened to Nora. He should have helped her. She'd offered him the designs once, years ago, just after Seth's funeral. He laughed, called them 40 pages of wishful thinking, told her glass couldn't warm a cabin, but now he sat inside it, and it was warmer than any room he'd known in a week. He looked at Rosie. "What if she doesn't come back?" "She will," the girl said, simply, and then a knock, but not at the door, at the back wall. Reuben rose like a shot, spun toward the sound. 3 raps, heavy, slow. He crossed the room and pulled open the rear hatch, the one Nora used to access the root cellar. She stood there, covered in ash and frost, her arms wrapped around a bundle. Reuben pulled her in. She nearly collapsed. "Blankets!" she gasped. He took the boy from her arms, unconscious but breathing, and wrapped him fast. She fell to her knees, breath coming ragged. He was the only one. Reuben said nothing, just wrapped a blanket around her too. Rosie appeared beside her a moment later with hot tea. Will lit another wick for more light, and when Reuben looked at the boy's face, he knew it. Son of the butcher family, from the far ridge. He hadn't even known they were still up there. "They called it pride," Nora whispered. "Said they didn't need help, said they'd make it through on their own." Reuben stared at her. She shook her head. "But pride doesn't keep you warm." The days that followed blurred together. More knocks, more strangers. 2 women from the East Trail, a father and daughter from the Frozen Creek Road, even a rancher and his mule, the animal half dead, but sheltered beside the barn wall Nora had reinforced with tar and wool packs. Each time they arrived shivering, ashamed. Each time Nora let them in. The cabin filled, but never overflowed. The heat held. The walls absorbed what light they could, then trapped it beneath the insulated floor. The black stone tiles beneath their feet felt warm even when the air dropped outside. Nora rationed food, taught the others how to use the clay patch system to keep the seams tight, showed Rosie how to unroll the hay-stuffed curtains at night to reduce thermal loss. One night, Reuben asked again, "You could rebuild this, for others, with help. You could make them listen now." Nora looked around the room, a room once mocked as a widow's folly, now filled with the quiet sound of breathing. She nodded. "Maybe when the spring comes." Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the thermometer nailed to the beam behind the stove ticked up, past freezing, past 50, towards 70. By the 6th day, the laughter had become become a kind of ghost, something that once echoed across town meetings and supply runs and idle conversations, but now lingered only in the memory of those who had dared to speak too loud and too early. And now, one by one, they were stepping through the frost-bitten veil between pride and desperation, arriving at the strange, stubborn cabin on the ridge. The one they'd once called a greenhouse, a joke, a widow's winter folly. It wasn't just travelers anymore. It was neighbors. It was people Nora had known since the days she arrived in Elk Hollow with Seth, pregnant and terrified, carrying more dreams than plans. People who'd turned their backs when she laid the first beams without a man's help. People who'd told her she was chasing a fantasy, that no home built of glass and dark stone could survive the mountain winters. Now they were showing up with frostbitten hands and blackened toes, and no more words in their mouths except one. Please, she let them in. It wasn't a question. It never had been. She had long since turned the root cellar into an auxiliary sleeping space, padded with straw and wool and the spare hay bales she'd hidden beneath the old garden. Shed back in September. The floor tiles above kept the heat sinking down. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in the freeze ever was, but it was better than anything else left standing. Inside, there were now 16 people, 16 souls in a cabin meant for 3, and somehow, impossibly, the temperature held. That morning, as Nora stood beside the southern wall, watching the pale gold light stream through the fogged-up panes, she realized something terrifying. The cabin wasn't just surviving, it was working, truly working. The internal heat was steady, the air didn't drop below 50, even on nights when the wind screamed through the valley like it meant to peel the mountains open. The floor tiles still held warmth at dawn. The condensation on the interior glass was thick, but never iced, a sign that the dew point inside stayed far above freezing. No logs needed, only coals, just a single shovelful a day. Everything else came from the sun. Reuben stood behind her, holding the boy she'd rescued 3 nights earlier. The child's cheeks had color again, his eyes followed movement. He didn't speak much, but his grip was strong when Rosie passed him bread. Your husband, Reuben said quietly. He was ahead of his time. Nora didn't look at him. No, she said. He just paid attention. To what? She tapped the glass. To what heat wants to do, to how it moves, to how it rises and sinks and settles and escapes. He didn't fight it like the rest of us. He worked with it. Reuben exhaled and leaned against the post. I've lived in the hills 20 years and I never thought to trap light, never thought to use the sun for more than drying laundry. He was an engineer before the war. Rail lines, bridges, said the sun gave off more power in an hour than all the trees in the territory, if we just learn how to hold it. I laughed at him too. Once, Reuben didn't answer. His silence was a kind of apology now. Across the room, 2 of the other men, locals who had once spoken Nora's name with the same tone they used for mold and superstition, were patching one of the ceiling seams with fresh resin. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It was something else, a proving ground, a quiet lesson being written in the breaths of the people who once scoffed, and they were learning. She saw it in the way they moved, carefully now, respectfully, the way they watched the light on the southern wall, nodding when the warmth bloomed up by noon, the way they crouched low at night to trap the heat near the floor, the way they peeled potatoes at the right time of day so the steam helped raise the humidity without drawing frost. The cabin had rules, and they followed them. But with every day that passed, Nora's unease grew. The cabin worked, yes, but it had limits, and they were drawing close. That night, the clouds didn't return. The wind stilled. It was the first full sky in a week, and with it came a terror far worse than storms, silence, the kind that dropped without warning, pressing on every beam and rafter like the breath of something waiting, a sky too clear, stars too sharp, a temperature that fell faster than it should have. By 10 p.m., the exterior thermometer had dropped to 36 degrees. By midnight it was 47 degrees. No one slept, not even the children. Inside, the cabin was 68 degrees, no fire, just coals and glass and Seth's notes brought to life. But outside was death. And it moved. It crept across the valley in stillness. It found the weak roofs, the snapped chimneys, the flawed insulation. It pressed into cracks and whispered through floorboards and pulled breath from mouths that hadn't believed in its reach. At 3 a.m., the second knock came. Not from the front, not from the rear, but from the side, the eastern wall, the one no door had ever been cut into. A single hand slapping wood. Once, then silence. No one moved. Nora was the first to stand. She crossed the room and found Rosie already awake, clutching the iron kettle like a shield. Reuben rose too, moving slow, unsure. Not the front, he whispered. No. She grabbed the poker, then the lantern, then the resin torch from the upper shelf. The knock came again. She unlatched the east panel and opened it to death. They listened. Every ear leaned in when Nora stood before the table, and spread out Seth's notes. Every head bowed when she said, "If we survive this winter, we build more." Even the ranchers nodded. No pride, no skepticism, just need and hope. Outside, the cold still waited, but inside, something stronger had taken root. Not just warmth, belief. When the worst of the freeze finally passed, it didn't do so with a thaw or a storm or a warm gust rolling down from the high passes. It ended with silence, not the sharp, waiting silence of fear, but the real one, the kind that lands when wind dies and birds haven't yet returned, and all that's left is a horizon of white and the faint crack of trees too cold to bend. The storm had lasted 11 days, 11 nights where temperatures dropped beyond what even the oldest trappers remembered. 11 nights where chimneys failed, roofs buckled, and pride froze in the throats of those who had once shaken their heads and said, "She's building a greenhouse." 11 nights where the only warmth for miles wasn't found in any fire, but in the stubborn angles of one glass wall facing south, and the woman who had refused to quit building it. On the 12th morning, the clouds parted for good. The sun came up without hurry, pale but golden, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the snow didn't fall, the trees didn't moan, the wind didn't snap like cloth soaked in ice, and the cabin, Nora Clark's glass cabin, stood like a flame that had outlived the storm. Inside, 23 people breathed. It was silent in the morning, always silent. No one moved until they heard her footsteps, light but certain, crossing the floor near the southern wall to check the glass. She always checked the glass first, and the thermometer, and the seams near the corners. Her rituals were law now. Then she'd nod, quiet and slow, still holding, and the others would rise. They rose that day too, but slower. Reuben had already gone out at first light, taking the 2 strongest men to check on other cabins. There were still no signs of the town marshal. The postmaster's roof had caved, the schoolhouse chimney had broken, and the old floorboards caught fire sometime during the 3rd night of the storm. No one had seen smoke because the snow covered everything. They found 2 bodies near Elk Creek, 3 more huddled in a root cellar that hadn't been sealed properly. The death count was 12, but the number might have doubled if not for the cabin. By midday, with the clouds long gone and the sun angled high enough to pour directly through the full wall of glass, the cabin's interior reached 71 degrees. 71. It wasn't just heat now. It was balm. It was grace. Nora walked barefoot across the southern floor with the baby in her arms, the one she'd pulled half frozen from her mother's grasp 3 nights earlier. The girl was warm now, small hands reaching for dust motes in the light. Behind Nora, Rosie braided a stranger girl's hair, while Will helped 2 of the ranch hands repair a cracked clay patch near the north seam. Reuben returned from the ridge with a map and frost-chapped cheeks, shaking his head when Nora asked how the Dawson place had fared. He didn't need to say it. She'd already guessed. The Dawson family had laughed the loudest. Now their cabin was a black square in the snow, the roof gone, the windows shattered, the back wall collapsed in what looked like a panic-burned hole. No footprints nearby, nothing alive. Reuben passed her the map, where he'd marked the safe shelters and the dead ones. She looked it over and ran a finger along the ridgeline. "That's the south slope," she said. He nodded. "The only places still standing are yours, the church and old Gregor's dugout. Everything else is cracked or buried." She didn't answer right away. She set the baby down, then walked to the window and stared out. The light was strong today, too strong to ignore. "You still have those tools?" she asked. Reuben blinked. "You mean my belt set?" "No, the ones Seth gave you, the draw plans." He hesitated, then nodded. "Some. You want to try a second build?" She looked at him. "Not me. Them." He turned. Behind them, the room had fallen silent. The others were listening again. "You think they'll follow?" he asked. She stepped onto the black floor tiles, warm underfoot. "They already are." That afternoon they laid out the sketches on the cabin table. Seth's notes, a patchwork of charcoal diagrams and sun-tracking angles and references to Roman bathhouses, and desert airwells and coal stoves from old Scandinavian blueprints, were translated aloud like sacred scripture. The glass wall wasn't magic. It was angles and patience. It was material and placement, an understanding that cold wasn't the only enemy. Ignorance was. Nora had spent the last year reading every line of those notes, tracing them in the margin, whispering the logic back to herself as she swept the floor or packed straw between wall seams. She had memorized how many degrees tilt gave the best capture in winter, how black stone held longer than red, how wet air inside could rot unless you knew how to vent it in rhythm with the sun. Now she taught, not with arrogance, but with steadiness. And they listened. The old rancher, who once said glass was only good for greenhouses, took the job of preparing thermal mass bricks. The preacher's wife, who had once warned the others that heat from the sun is only temporary, the Lord's fire is eternal, now helped seal the new southern wall with the same resin paste she'd used for her own candles. Even Reuben followed her lead. He hauled the stones, measured the timber. He'd cut her off once, back when her grief made her easy to dismiss. But now he stood with head bowed, waiting for instructions like anyone else. They didn't call her widow anymore, just Nora, and when she said, "We're building another," no one questioned her. They started laying the foundation 2 days later, just up the ridge, where the slope faced south and the snow had already begun to melt faster. It wouldn't be finished by spring, maybe not even summer, but the next winter wouldn't catch them unprepared. Not again. On the 7th day after the freeze broke, the first horseman from the southern valley arrived. He wore a red scarf and rode a mule so thin it looked like it was stitched from shadow. Behind him came a train of others, 6, 10, 15 in total, stragglers from downriver, from Ridge Hollow, from beyond the pass where the real mountains started. They came hungry, frost-bitten, hollow-eyed, and they asked for warmth. Nora met them at the edge of the trail. She looked behind her, at the cabin now glowing soft gold in the late sun. Then she pointed to the ridge. "There," she said, "we're building another." They followed. By spring, there were 5 more. Not perfect, not refined, not full glass walls, but enough. Each one faced south, each one lined with dark stone, each one taught to trap the heat like a breath held through the longest night. And when the next freeze came, not as brutal, not as long, but still deadly, they held, all of them, and not a single life was lost. Years later, they asked Nora how she'd known. She told them the truth. She hadn't, not fully. She just knew Seth hadn't been wrong, that the sun gave off more power than any log fire. That glass, placed right, didn't invite the cold, it caught the light. That the world had lied to them when it said widows were helpless and grief made you weak. And when the museum in Elk Hollow asked for the original cabin plans, she sent them. But she kept the cracked glass wall. It still stood, decades later. Sunlight still passed through it each morning. And though the wood around it had changed, and the roof had been redone, and the ridge path widened and paved, the wall itself stayed untouched, just fogged by age, whispering its warmth through the generations. And no one laughed anymore. Not at the widow, not at the glass, not when the snow fell, and not when the cabin stayed warm.